Lecture 70, Mark Twain.
There weren't nothing to do now but to look out sharp for the town and not pass it without seeing it. Jim said he'd be mighty sure to see it because he'd be a free man the minute he seen it. Jim said it made him feel all over trembly and feverish to be so close to freedom. Well, I can tell you it made me all over trembly and feverish too to hear him, because I began to get it through my head that he was most free. And who to blame for it? Why, me. Conscience says to me, what had poor Miss Watson done to you, that you could see her nigger go right off under your eyes and never say one single word? What did that poor old woman do to you that you could treat her so mean? So says the title character in Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, first published in 1884 and generally considered Twain's masterpiece. Having played a supporting role in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, published in 1876, Huck Finn now takes his center stage as the narrator of his own adventure story. It begins in Hannibal, Missouri, on the banks of the Mississippi River, where Twain grew up, and it takes place around 1840 in the time of Twain's boyhood, when slavery prevailed in the American South and slaves were the legal property of their owners. In Huckleberry Finn, a 12-year-old white boy rides down the Mississippi River on a raft with a runaway black slave named Jim. Huck, too, is a runaway. With no mother and a shiftless, abusive, overbearing drunk for a father, he has been unofficially adopted by a widow named Douglas and is living in her house at the beginning of the novel. Along with her sister, Miss Watson, the widow sets out to civilize Huck. Though he chafes at the regimen imposed by these two women, he's just beginning to get accustomed to school and the comforts of living in a house when his deadbeat father angrily reclaims him and takes him 3 miles upriver to an old log hut in a stand of thick woods where they live by hunting and fishing. For a while, life in the woods suits Huck. Since his father thinks school is nothing but highfalutin foolishness, Huck briefly savors the freedom of lazing around all day, smoking and fishing and never cracking a book. But life with an alcoholic father soon becomes a monumental pain. After getting regularly beaten with a hickory stick and locked up alone in the hut for days on end whenever the father goes away, Huck decides that he must get out on his own. Not wanting to be cramped up and civilized again in the house of the widow, who might win the legal right to be his guardian, Huck saws his way out of the hut while his father is away. He then fakes his own death, takes a gun and various provisions from the hut, and paddles off down the Mississippi in a canoe that he found drifting one day and hid for his getaway. Soon enough, he joins another runaway. Stopping at an island in the middle of the river, he finds Jim, Miss Watson's slave, who has run away because he overheard her say that she planned to sell him down the river into far worse slavery than he has endured up to now. At first, Huck is shocked to learn that Jim has run away, but he swears not to report him, and by that very act he seems to recognize what links him to the black man, what links the black man to the white boy. Faced with an impossible choice between the constraints of civilization and the brutality of his drunken, abusive, possessive father, Huck has run away. When Huck takes a little trip to the Illinois shore in disguise and finds out that 2 men are headed out to the island after midnight to look for Jim, he races back to the island and tells Jim, "They're after us." Not after you, notice, but after us, you and me. As they set out at night on a section of a lumber raft that they had earlier found floating in the river, we are surely tempted to see them as two kindred spirits yearning to be free, the man and the boy who have escaped. But the novel soon undercuts any impulse we might have to think of Jim and Huck as simply blood brothers under the skin, as if skin color made no difference. Let's look closely at the passage I quoted a few minutes ago, where Huck mentions a particular town of great importance to them. As the boy and the man glide down the great Mississippi, the town they're looking out sharp for, is Cairo, Illinois. Cairo stands on the southern tip of the state of Illinois. At this point, the Ohio River, which flows down from the east, enters the Mississippi, which marks the western border of Illinois, and flows all the way down to New Orleans. Starting from Hannibal, Missouri, which is just across the Mississippi from Illinois, Jim and Huck ride their raft down past St. Louis all the way to Cairo at the bottom tip of Illinois. Cairo is hugely important to Jim because he sees it as the gateway to his freedom. In the 1840s, southern Illinois was dominated by slaveholders, so Jim can hardly expect to find freedom there. Instead, he and Huck plan to sell their raft once they get to Cairo, and then take a steamboat up the Ohio River to the Free States. All this sounds fine, you might say. But notice how differently Jim and Huck respond to the prospect of Jim's freedom. According to Huck, Jim trembles with excitement. Jim said it made him feel all over trembly and feverish to be so close to freedom. Huck is likewise trembly and feverish, but not at all for the same reason as Jim. Huck sweats and trembles because his conscience is not free. It's shackled to the assumptions on which slavery was founded, and specifically to the notion that one human being can belong to another as a piece of property. So in spite of his affection for Jim as a fellow runaway, Huck feels guilty about helping him escape, because in doing so, he's aiding and abetting a thief, helping Jim to steal himself Miss Watson's property from Miss Watson. What had poor Miss Watson done to you? Huck asks himself. What had poor Miss Watson done to you, that you could see her nigger go right off under your eyes and never say one single word? From this question, one word jumps right out before us: nigger. The very presence of this word has prompted some school authorities to yank the whole book from the curriculum, even at the Mark Twain Intermediate School of Fairfax, Virginia. Huckleberry Finn has always given some people fits. In 1885, just after it first appeared, the guardians of the Public Library of Concord, Massachusetts, thought it unfit for impressionable young minds. Now it is called racist because it uses the N-word. But in the 1840s, the N-word was a colloquial term commonly used by whites and blacks alike. It is part of Huck's regional dialect and therefore essential to his vernacular narrative. Anything else in place of the N-word here would have falsified Huck's voice. Huck has no idea that he's offending anyone when he uses this term, just as he has no idea that he's offending anyone by presuming that Jim is the rightful property of Miss Watson. On the contrary, that very presumption makes him feel guilty of aiding and abetting a thief even while doing so. And the same presumption leaves him shocked to hear Jim say that he plans to steal his own children away from their master. So the adventure story of Huckleberry Finn is not just the story of a voyage to freedom. It's the story of a struggle within Huck himself. A little civil war between a conscience bound to the assumptions of slaveholding and a heart beating in sympathy with a black man's quest for freedom. In Huckleberry Finn, Twain fuses the story of a boy's rafting adventure with the history of the struggle to break the chain of slavery in the whole United States. By the time Mark Twain started writing this novel in the summer of 1876, he was already well known as a humorist on the stage as well as on the page. Born in Florida, Missouri in 1835 and christened Samuel Clemens, he was the sixth child of a genteel lawyer who failed in a succession of enterprises, and of a lively, red-headed, pipe-smoking, storytelling woman named Jane Lambton Clemens, who surely inspired the wit and imagination of her little boy, Sam. Since the family moved to Hannibal when Sam was not quite 4 years old, he got all of his formal schooling there. But it ended not long after his father's death in 1847. By his mid-teens, Sam was a working man of print, first a printer's apprentice and then assistant editor of a Hannibal newspaper run by his brother Orion. This kind of work proved a continuing education. In mid-19th century Hannibal, newspapers kept him not only abreast of news, but also up on literature of various kinds, especially American humor, which led him to produce his own specimens of it for Hannibal newspapers. Like Dickens and Melville, who had scarcely more formal schooling than he, Twain read widely, valued learning, and made himself a writer by writing. But Twain took a winding route to literary fame. After moving to St. Louis in 1853, when he was 18, he started training to become a steamboat pilot on the lower Mississippi. This job gave him rich material for many of his later writings, such as Life on the Mississippi and, of course, Huckleberry Finn. In a sense, the Mississippi also gave him his name. One important duty of a steamboat pilot was to report the depth of the river as the boat progressed. So Samuel Clemens took his pen name from the phrase used to report 2 fathoms of water, Mark Twain. The young Mark Twain was a man in motion. In the summer of 1861, after 4 years of steamboat piloting on the Mississippi, he joined the Confederate militia, deserted after just 2 weeks, and then left for the Nevada Territory. He failed to make any money in mining there, but he succeeded in making his name as a humorist and witty reporter in the Virginia City Territorial Enterprise. He then moved to San Francisco in May of 1864. Now he hit his stride. Besides reporting, briefly editing a newspaper, and writing humorous sketches for literary weeklies, he launched himself as a platform humorist. And in the hills of California, he struck pay dirt, not in the ground, but in the frontier tales that he picked up in the mining camps. At the suggestion of his friend Artemus Ward, who was then America's leading humorist, Twain turned one of these frontier tales into a short story that first appeared in a New York paper on November 18, 1865, and was soon reprinted throughout the country. 2 years later, it appeared as the title story in Twain's first book, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County and Other Sketches. This book made Twain's name by its richly layered style of deadpan storytelling. The title story, in which a famous frog loses a jumping contest because it has been secretly stuffed with gunshot, is told by a seemingly dim-witted frontiersman who gives no hint that he knows the story is funny. The secret of deadpan storytelling. In December of 1866, Twain left San Francisco for New York. After a brief stay there, he sailed to Europe and traveled to the Holy Lands of the Middle East to gather material for an irreverent book called Innocents Abroad. Then, after buying a share of the Buffalo Express and briefly editing it, he married the wealthy Olivia Langdon, moved with her to Hartford, Connecticut, built a mansion there, and settled down to write his books. In the early 1870s, he produced Roughing It, a droll recreation of his years in the Nevada Territory, and The Gilded Age, his first novel, co-authored with Charles Dudley Warner. This book satirically bears the pretentiousness of the middle class and the greed and corruption of politicians and businessmen in the aftermath of the Civil War. For the first of the novels that he wrote by himself, Twain now started mining the memory of his boyhood in Hannibal, Missouri. In Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which appeared in 1876, the fictional town of St. Petersburg obviously springs from the Hannibal of Twain's boyhood. But Twain reshapes his memories in ways that reflect a wide variety of literary influences. On the high end, so to speak, his novel evokes Don Quixote, one of his favorite books. In Twain's world, Tom and Huck reenact the relation between Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, the fantasizing knight and his down-to-earth squire in Cervantes' 17th century novel of pseudo-epic adventure. Like Cervantes' knight, Don Quixote, Tom rides the wild horse of his overheated imagination. Like Sancho Panza, Huck keeps his eyes on the ground and the facts. But even as Twain evokes a literary classic, he also draws on his own earlier burlesques of Sunday school stories that idolized the good boy and vilified the bad boy. Twain turns this formula upside down. Tom Sawyer lies, steals, smokes, runs away from home, and pals around with an unchristian boy. Nevertheless, he ends up with all the goodies normally furnished to good boys alone. He gets money, popularity, and the good girl, the blonde, blue-eyed, well-to-do, innocent Becky Thatcher. Twain's next book was Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which is, of course, a sequel to Tom Sawyer. At the end of Tom Sawyer, bad boy Tom becomes part of the community, talks Huck into joining his gang, and even tries to make Huck let the widow Douglas adopt him. At the beginning of Huckleberry Finn, Huck decides to run away down the river. This radical move by a character quite different from Tom Sawyer generates not just a sequel to the novel Tom Sawyer, but a fundamentally new novel. Though the full title of each novel begins with the word adventures, Huck's adventures differ sharply from Tom's, which are outlandishly quixotic. Leading a would-be savage attack on a supposed company of rich Arabs and Spanish merchants, Tom simply goads the gang into scaring off a bunch of kids at a Sunday school picnic, where the loot is hardly more than donuts and jam, which the teacher makes them drop. Quite different from this sort of prank is Huck's decision to run away, and especially his decision to run away with a slave. Here, the danger and excitement are not imaginary, but real. Besides risking his life on a raft, which he rides at night to elude detection, Huck chooses to live by his wits, and he also chooses to help a slave gain his freedom, an act that makes them both outlaws and thus endangers them both. In the 1840s, slavery was real, and it was slowly gestating what was to be the bloodiest war the nation had ever known. With extraordinary imagination and daring, Twain took this great and bloody conflict between the North and the South, between the institution of slavery and the bedrock American principle of liberty for all. He took this great historic conflict and thrust it inside the head of a 12-year-old boy. So Huck's adventure is not merely physical but psychological, the struggle to resolve two warring principles. To put the conflict inside Huck's head and to dramatize Huck's continuing struggle to resolve it, Twain had to make another important change, this time in his technique of narration. Tom Sawyer, the novel, that is, includes the regional dialect of its characters whenever they speak, but the novel is narrated in the standard, correct American English of an educated adult. By contrast, Huckleberry Finn is narrated from the start in the ungrammatical vernacular of the boy himself, who quickly establishes his own kind of tough-minded authority. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. But that ain't no matter. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth, mainly. There was things which he stretched, but mainly he told the truth. That is nothing. I never seen anybody but lied one time or another. Huck thus presents himself from the outset as a boy who knows the difference between truth and lies, a boy whose raw-boned vernacular speech seems to assure us that he will spurn all fancy phrasing and genteel grammar in favor of raw, unvarnished fact. But if Huck had never seen anybody but lied one time or another, as he says, then he must include himself. And he does indeed tell some stretchers. To pick up information about their pursuers just after he finds Jim on the island, Huck goes ashore dressed as a girl and pretends to be looking for her uncle to help her sick mother. Later on, Huck lies even to Jim. Sometimes, in fact, Huck plays the quixotic role of Tom to Jim's Sancho Panza, making up fabulous stories while poor old Jim just keeps a firm grip on the facts. One foggy night when Jim is on the raft and Huck is in the canoe, a swift current suddenly takes the raft flying off by itself in the fog. When Huck catches up with the raft after several hours and finds Jim asleep on it, he pretends that he's been with Jim all along, that Jim has simply dreamed about their getting separated in the fog. But Jim, who is overwhelmed with relief to see Huck safe and sound again, is disgusted to see that Huck is simply trying to make a fool of old Jim with a lie. Stricken with remorse, Huck apologizes to Jim and never again plays such a trick on him, or so he says. You can judge for yourself when you come to the end of the book. In thus resolving to be honest with Jim, Huck seems to underscore the pledge he has already made implicitly to us, his readers. He may lie to other characters in the book, but he will never lie to us. We have already seen evidence of this honesty in the passage I read first, where Huck frankly tells us that he feels guilty about helping Jim escape, because Jim is Miss Watson's property. But notice that Huck never mentions his misgivings to Jim. On the contrary, even as his conscience flogs him for aiding and abetting the theft of a slave, he lets Jim think that he wholeheartedly backs Jim's quest for freedom. So however honest Huck would like to be with Jim, he practices duplicity. This duplicity persists because the two runaways miss the gateway to freedom for Jim. While riding down the river one night, they unwittingly passed the town of Cairo and thus missed their chance to catch a steamboat up the Ohio River to the Free States. Critics have debated just why Twain decided to send them shooting past Cairo instead of stopping them there and sending them north, or at least sending Jim north. Twain himself seems to have puzzled over this question because he came to a stop in his writing of the book just before the two passed Cairo, and he didn't return to the story for nearly 2 years. By that time, he seems to have decided to keep the two runaways on the great Mississippi. By this means, he could show the contrast between the freedom of the river and the constraints of life on shore, where blacks are shackled by slavery and whites shackled by cruelty, hypocrisy, and violence. All of these traits can be found in the Grangerford family. When a steamboat slams the raft one night and the runaways end up in the river, Huck loses sight of Jim, swims to shore, finds his way to a log house, and is taken in by an aristocratic family named Grangerford. They feed him well and treat him very kindly in their genteelly furnished house. In some ways, it's a house furnished in mourning. Among the many things Huck describes is the funereal handiwork of the late Emmeline Grangerford. Before dying in her teens, she left not only crayon drawings of mournful women, but also mawkish elegies, such as the one on Stephen Dowling Botts, who died by falling down a well. But in spite of all this mourning, the Grangerford family is locked in a deadly feud with the Shepperson clan. 3 of the Grangerford sons have already died in the feud, and right before Huck's eyes, young Buck Grangerford, a boy of Huck's age, tries to kill a Shepperson. Even though Buck's sister wants to marry the man, and Buck has no idea what started the feud some generations back, he's locked into it for life, and nothing will stop it or him. On the last Sunday Huck spends with them, the Grangerfords all go to church with the Shepperdsons to hear a sermon about brotherly love, and then start yet another shootout that leaves all the male Grangerfords dead, including Buck. So much for brotherly love. But Huck survives all this. Finding Jim again and learning that their raft has somehow withstood its collision with the steamboat, Huck is powerful glad to get away from the feuds and to be back on the raft. Other places, he says, do seem so cramped up and smothery, but a raft don't. You feel mighty free and easy and comfortable on a raft. Nevertheless, as easy and comfortable as life on a raft may be, it does not take the runaways north to freedom. It takes them south, right into the heart of the slave states, where runaways can be readily caught. Furthermore, Huck's conscience never stops lashing him. When Jim is caught and turned over to a farmer who expects a reward for him, Huck feels duty-bound to report this fact in a note to Miss Watson so that she can reclaim her property. Only then, Huck thinks, can he wash himself clean of sin and save himself from hell. But as soon as he remembers the warmth of his friendship with Jim, he takes the note, he studies it for a minute, then says to himself, all right then, I'll go to hell, and tore it up. This could be read as Huck's finest hour. The daring expression of his willingness to risk his very soul for the sake of ensuring the freedom of his dear friend Jim, and thus playing his own small role in the great American drama of emancipating the slaves. But Twain plays a wicked trick on us. Just after Huck makes what sounds like the finest and noblest speech, Tom Sawyer appears, bursting with eagerness for brand new adventures. He's come down to visit his Aunt Sally and Uncle Silas Phelps, the very same farmer who is now holding Jim. When Tom learns that Huck hopes to steal Jim out of slavery, he instantly volunteers to help Huck do it, not in the simple, straightforward way that Huck has conceived, but by means of a plan as daring and dangerous as possible. He told me what it was, says Huck, and I see in a minute it was worth 15 of mine for style, and would make Jim just as free a man as mine would, and maybe get us all killed besides. The last part exemplifies the recklessness of Tom's plan, which has everything to do with excitement and nothing to do with real purpose or with the dignity of Jim. To maximize the difficulty of freeing Jim, Tom insists that he and Huck must dig their way under Jim's locked cabin and come up through a hole under his bed. To maximize the misery of Jim's captivity, they load up his cabin with rats and snakes. To maximize the danger of freeing him, Tom writes an anonymous letter saying that a gang of cutthroats plans to steal him, and then he leaves the letter where it can easily be found by the Phelpses. This ensures that on the night the boys come to free Jim, 15 gun-toting farmers stand ready to shoot them down. And the guns draw blood, with dismal consequences for Jim. Though the boys manage to spring Jim from his cabin, Tom ends up with a bullet in the calf of his leg, which means that a doctor must be called to treat him. When the doctor arrives, he finds not only Tom, but Jim, who is promptly locked up again, put in chains, and fed no more than bread and water. Notice what Tom's plan has done to Jim. He's been subjected to one humiliation after another. He's been made to fear for his life. And after a brief, tantalizing taste of freedom, he is shackled worse than ever. Only now, after all that, does Tom reveal what he's known all along. Old Miss Watson died 2 months previous and was so ashamed of her impulse to sell Jim down the river that in her will she set him free. At this revelation, Tom's Aunt Sally asks him the obvious question. What on earth did you want to free him for, seeing he was already free? Why, says Tom, I wanted the adventure of it. Adventure. That's the key word. Tom loves adventure, and above all, the adventure of freeing a slave. He tells Huck, in fact, that he wishes they could keep it up all the rest of our lives and leave Jim to our children to get out. He believed Jim would come to like it better and better the more he got used to it. What a thought! Entranced with the idea of making Jim their plaything forever, Tom is exploitative, self-indulgent, and cruel. His notion of adventure seems to sabotage everything that Huck has tried to do for Jim. Up to now, it seems Huck has been engaged in the truly daring and noble enterprise of freeing a slave. Because Tom turns this noble enterprise into a boy's crazy game, and then reveals that the slave was free all along, many readers feel swindled by the last part of this book. But Twain's ending actually exposes the Tom Sawyer in each of us. Published in 1884, almost a full 20 years after the Civil War ended slavery in America, this book has given all of its readers the pleasure of witnessing a moral battle that has already been won, as we very well know. Knowing now that slavery is dead and branded immoral, we can rejoice in Huck's struggle with his own slave-bound conscience. And when he says that he'll go to hell for not reporting the runaway, we know that he's earned a place in our heaven, the heaven of freedom and equality for all races. But Tom's crazy adventure pricks the balloon of our sentiment, of our self-righteousness. Tom's play is the final joke that Twain springs on us. Notice again what Huck says about Tom's way of freeing Jim. It beats any other for style, he says, and may get them all killed besides. If up to now we've been cheering for Northern morality against slaveholding Southern morality, let's remember what Northern morality brought us. The Northern way of freeing the slaves didn't get us all killed, but it did slaughter some 750,000 men, more than any other war in America up to that time. So make no mistake, beneath the humor of this book, beneath its lyrical evocation of the freedom of the river, beneath the tender affection between a white boy and a black man, beneath all that lies its merciless revelation of our capacity for cruelty, exploitation, and violence, and of all the harm we have done, all the terrible harm we have done and are even now doing in the name of good. This is a distinctively American problem, for which, with all our power and wealth, we have not yet found a solution. And that is one reason why, well over 100 years after it first appeared, Huckleberry Finn remains an American classic.